All right, hopefully you have some colored pencils around your desk and a copy of the article that you'll be reading for actually this week's assignment. We'll be discussing the March on Washington, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X this entire week. So this article will be referenced quite often. So because of that, it'll be worth our time to kind of take a deeper look at it. So if I mark anything or tell you to underline anything, go ahead and do what I do. It doesn't really bother me about using a different color of colored pencil, or you can use the same colored pencil as I do. That's totally up to you. All right, so the March on Washington, this article happens to give us a little piece of information here before. This excerpt, which remember is just a part from a book, so I would like for you to take note of that. Go ahead and underline excerpt and write a part from a larger piece. Is about the March on Washington that was taken from a larger book, Civil Rights Marches, by Linda and Charles George. These authors have written more than 70 books for classroom use about a number of topics. They co-author works of fiction and nonfiction for children, teens, and adults. All right, so we just found out kind of a little bit about our authors and where this article came from. This lets me know that the article was definitely credible and reliable, and that I could pass it out and it would be factual for my students. So that's what I look for when I select articles to give to you. I always need to make sure that they are reliable and credible. Okay, let's begin. In May of 1963, the nation focused its attention on Birmingham, Alabama. Martin Luther King Jr. had called it the most segregated city in America, and he chose it for its major series of demonstrations. So remember, and I'd like for you to write this. Go ahead and circle segregation, and off to the side write that means that it's separate. So you might have the same drinking fountains, but they're different. They're separate drinking fountains for black versus white. So that's what segregated means. He chose this because their plan was to have marches, boycotts, and sit-ins were planned to try to win desegregation of stores, restaurants, and other public places. So by having all of these boycotts and marches, obviously the bigger goal was to end segregation. And if they could desegregate stores, that would mean that all blacks and whites could sit at the counter at a restaurant. When the police arrived, some of the black demonstrators were attacked by snarling German shepherds. Others were hurled against buildings by stinging jets of water. And I'm guessing that you guys might remember what event might these authors be referring to that they didn't directly actually say. Do you remember when dogs were brought out? Do you remember when the hoses were brought out in Birmingham on the streets? Whom were those two horrible violent acts directed towards? They were directed towards the kids. That was the Children's March. So that's who the author is actually referring to right here. So if you could just kind of circle those two things and then write children out to the side, Children's March out to the side, I think that is worthy of you guys noting right here. As a result, many whites began to understand the often brutal rules of segregation. So I'll give you a second to finish writing that it was the Children's March off to the side right there. And then we can go ahead and move on to the next page. Horrified by the images of the violence in Birmingham, President John F. Kennedy sent a civil rights bill to Congress in June to end segregation in hotels, restaurants, theaters, and all public places. It also gave the Justice Department the power to sue school districts that refused to desegregate. To urge Congress to pass the bill, A. Philip Randolph proposed another march on Washington to unite people behind the historic law. What President Kennedy has done here is massive. He has designed a bill for Congress that would allow us to sue school districts and basically demand desegregation in all of the hotels, restaurants, and theaters, so forth, in Birmingham and around the country. So you can imagine that this probably is going to upset a lot of white supremacists. Randolph proposed another march on Washington. So the march on Washington that is about to happen, that everybody remembers Martin Luther King, his I Have a Dream speech, took place at this march. You know, that's what's about to happen here. And I just want it to be clear to you. So I'd like for you to underline this, and then I want you to underline down here like I did, and I want you to make the connection that that's the cause of the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King gave his I Have a Dream speech. I want you to understand why that big event happened. And it happened because a bunch of people decided it would be a good idea to get behind President Kennedy's civil rights bill for Congress and unite everybody behind this new law, and how amazing it is that Kennedy was going to pass this. And it really was honestly a time to celebrate, and a time to show support for this new law that was about ready to be passed. So take a second and circle, underline, write down, and understand why the March on Washington even existed in the first place, which was to celebrate the bill, civil rights bill that John F. Kennedy was about ready to pass. I think that's very important for us to understand that. Okay. Moving on down, on August 28th of 1963, nearly 250,000 people from almost every state in the Union gathered at the Lincoln Memorial. 80 million Americans viewed the event on television. They heard the intelligent, informed, and thoughtful words of the Black spokesman from all walks of life. Many saw clearly for the first time the truth behind Black Americans' struggle for equal treatment. So we know that television was, we don't have the social media. They did not have the social media that you guys definitely have today, but what they did have was television. And so, the pictures of what happened in Birmingham when they were televised, and people were starting to realize just how bad the inequalities were, that was television actually, I think, helped the cause, the movement, by spreading around what was happening. All right, let's go ahead and go to the next page. You can underline this first sentence here. For one day, thousands of Americans walked together, they ate together, they laughed together, and they cried together. Not one ugly incident spoiled the day. As Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in 1964, it was an army without guns, but not without strength. Of every faith members, of every class, of every profession, every political party were united by a single ideal, which was obviously freedom. These words right here, I think, are very important. For one day, thousands of Americans, they walked together, they ate together, they laughed together, and they cried together. We are talking about blacks and whites, and therefore that is why they mark the March on Washington such a success. The March on Washington, there had been so much violence with protesting. Every single time African Americans protested, whether it be in Birmingham or other cities, they were always met with violence. This was one of the first protests, was the March on Washington, where the whole entire day was peaceful, without any retaliation. Quite a success story. By late afternoon, the marchers were tired, but when Randolph introduced the morale leader of our nation, the crowd came alive. So if you had to make an inference, who do you think this leader is that Randolph speaks of? If you're guessing that it's MLK, that is a very good reference. You are correct. Dr. King began slowly and formally presenting his prepared speech. As he spoke, the crowd responded with great emotion. Dr. King soon forgot about the speech he had written. Instead, he told the world about his dream of justice, a world without color barriers. His desire for equality and freedom touched the hearts of all who heard it. His speech continues to inspire people today. So I thought that was really interesting, and I wanted to know if you knew that the I Have a Dream speech that is so famous was actually not prepared by MLK. It was not written on note cards that he read from on that day. His old speech was tossed aside and he ad-libbed. In other words, he made it up as he spoke. That very famous speech was actually just from his heart. Even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. And when we follow freedom to ring from every village, from every hamlet, from every state and every city, we will be able to join hands and sing, free at last, thank God Almighty, we are free at last. So this excerpt, okay, this is just one part of his speech. The speech was much longer. So this is a perfect example of what that word was I was teaching you earlier of an excerpt. It's better heard. You really got to listen to Dr. Martin Luther King read the speech and hear him deliver it because he was such a powerful speaker. All right. The people cheered wildly. Many wept. The power of King's speech lay in the voice it gave to the hope of 22 million Black Americans. Later that day, Dr. King and the other leaders of the march met with President Kennedy at the White House. So Kennedy was an excellent president in the light that he was trying to help African Americans push the movement forward and bring peace to the nation. President Kennedy, unfortunately, because of that, died for it. Kennedy did not live to see the Civil Rights Bill become law. He was shot and killed in Dallas, Texas on November 22nd of 63. So President Johnson used his influence in the Congress to ensure the passage of the bill. On July 2nd of 1964, Martin Luther King Jr., as you can see in the picture right there, along with many other proud civil rights leaders, watched President Johnson sign the bill into law. You know, and I go with a pencil, go ahead and underline this part about Kennedy being assassinated. And, you know, it's a real shame that Kennedy didn't get to see his idea of the bill enforced because he was killed for that idea. Okay, so just, if anything, if I could just go back and remind you, one of the biggest things I wanted you to learn from this article is the reason for the March on Washington, which was to celebrate and support Kennedy's idea of the Civil Rights Bill going to Congress and to show the support for this idea. All right, and there you have the article.